She answered her phone at 3:47 in the morning, the way she answered everything. On the first ring, voice clear, no trace of sleep. Reyes. That was the only word. One word, and somehow it contained everything about her. The precision, the readiness, the absolute refusal to be caught off guard by anything the world decided to throw at her in the dark. Special Agent Mara Reyes, 39 years old, 14 years with the FBI's Violent Crimes Unit out of the Chicago field office, 112 successful convictions, 3 commendations for valor, 1 reprimand for insubordination, which she kept framed on the inside of her closet door as a reminder that the truth, spoken plainly and without apology to the wrong person at the wrong time, always costs something. She was 5 feet 7 inches tall, lean and precise in the way that years of discipline build into the body without vanishing when the body ages. She kept her dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painted on. Her eyes were the color of black coffee and carried roughly the same warmth until the moment you needed her on your side, at which point they became the most focused, intelligent, and terrifying eyes in any room. Her partner, Special Agent Dion Marsh, had once told a rookie during orientation, "When Reyes looks at you, she's already 3 steps ahead of whatever you're thinking. Don't waste her time, and don't mistake her calm for comfort. The calm is the danger." She didn't sleep much. She didn't need to. Sleep, she had told Dion once during a 30-hour surveillance shift in a parking garage in Pilsen, was for people who weren't afraid of what happened when their minds went quiet. What happened in Mara Reyes's mind when it went quiet was a room, not metaphorical, a real room she could describe down to the grain of the floorboards, a small bedroom in a house outside of Rockford, Illinois, where a 9-year-old girl named Sofia Mendez had been found dead on a Tuesday morning, 17 years ago. Mara had been a 22-year-old Marine corporal home on leave, staying at her cousin's apartment 2 blocks away when she heard the sirens. She had gone to look, the way people do when sirens cut through a neighborhood at that hour. She had seen the mother on the front lawn, folded over herself like something broken at the center, past the point where hands and comfort can reach. She had seen the yellow tape. She had seen the investigator in a rumpled jacket standing near the front porch, not writing anything down, just staring at his shoes. And she had understood, in the cold and specific way that some people are simply built to understand things, that someone had walked into that child's room and made a decision that destroyed an entire world, and that nobody was going to answer for it unless the right person made answering unavoidable. 3 months later, Mara Reyes had submitted her application to the FBI Academy. She had never stopped working that case in the back of her mind, quietly, in the years since. It was never officially hers, but it was hers. The call that Tuesday morning came from her supervisor, Assistant Special Agent in Charge David Karimi, and he skipped the preamble in a way that told her everything about the severity before the first sentence ended. He said, "We have a situation with the Alderman case. Reyes, I need you in the office in 30 minutes, and I need you to have already decided you're going to hold your temper when I tell you what happened." She was already sitting up. She was already reaching for her badge on the nightstand. She said, "Tell me now." Karimi exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale that carries bad news the way a storm cloud carries rain, the weight of it visible before a single drop falls. He said, "Witness is dead, Marcus Webb, found in the river an hour ago, and Internal Affairs is saying, there may have been a leak from inside our unit." The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Mara Reyes was not a woman who wasted silence, and those 2 seconds were not empty. They were the sound of something clicking into place behind her eyes, some mechanism of focus and fury and cold, determined calculation that would not stop running until she had the truth in her hands and had pressed it irrefutably into the public record. She said, "Who knows?" Karimi said, "Right now, you, me, and whoever killed him." She was already dressed before she ended the call. The Alderman case had been 18 months in the making. The target was Vincent Alderman, 54 years old,
former city contracts director, currently the operational architect of a money laundering network that moved approximately $40 million annually through a web of construction shell companies, 3 crooked aldermen, 1 deputy commissioner, and a logistics firm in Cicero that nobody had been able to touch, because every time someone got close, the case developed a hole. Not a crack, a hole. The kind that didn't happen by accident. Marcus Webb had been their bridge, a mid-level bookkeeper inside one of Alderman's shell companies who had come forward 8 months ago carrying 3 years of internal financial records on an encrypted hard drive he'd kept in a fireproof safe under his kitchen sink because, as he had told Mara in their first meeting, "I've been afraid to take this to anyone for 2 years, but I'm more afraid of what happens if nobody ever does." She had sat across from him in a nondescript conference room with a cup of coffee growing cold between her hands, and she had looked at him, this small, frightened, profoundly decent man with a manila folder of documentation that represented genuine personal courage, and she had said, with the full weight of her authority and the full sincerity of her character, "I will protect you. That is not a formality. That is a promise." Marcus Webb was now at the bottom of the Chicago River, and Mara Reyes drove to the field office in the dark with both hands on the wheel and a fury so controlled and so complete that it felt, from the outside, like absolute calm. She arrived in 28 minutes. The office was quiet in the particular way that government buildings are quiet at 4 in the morning, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant percussion of a keyboard somewhere, the smell of old coffee and recycled air. Karimi was waiting for her in the conference room with 2 other agents she trusted and a manila folder that was considerably thinner than it should have been. He said, "Before you say anything, I want you to know that I believe you did everything right." She sat down. She opened the folder. She looked at what was inside. Then she looked up at him and said, in a voice so level it could have served as a carpenter's instrument, "Tell me who had access to Webb's location." The answer to that question was a list of 7 names, and Mara read each one with the same expression she brought to all evidence. Not suspicion, not accusation, but the precise, uncolored attention of someone cataloging facts. 6 of those names she would have trusted with her life. The 7th made something shift behind her eyes, and she held it there for a moment longer than the others before turning the page. The 7th name was Special Agent Craig Donner, 42 years old, 11 years with the Bureau, assigned to white-collar crimes for most of his tenure before a transfer to violent crimes 14 months ago that had seemed unremarkable at the time, and now, in the terrible clarity of 4 in the morning with a dead witness between them, felt like a thread Mara could not believe she had not pulled sooner. Karimi watched her face. He said, "I know what you're thinking." She said, "You don't. You're thinking suspicion. I'm thinking architecture." He frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning, whoever moved Marcus Webb from protected status to the bottom of the river needed 3 things: his location, his testimony schedule, and the name of his contact at the DA's office." She set the folder down. Those 3 pieces of information don't exist in any single document. They exist in the sum of what 3 different people in this unit knew. Someone collected all 3. That's not panic, Karimi. That's planning. Deshaun Marsh arrived 14 minutes later, still pulling on his jacket, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has been trained to maintain composure and is currently using every milligram of that training. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with the kind of steadiness that had made him Mara's partner for 6 years, not because he was as sharp as she was, but because he was honest in a way that had no exceptions, and in a world where that quality was rarer than any tactical skill, Mara valued it above nearly everything. He sat down, looked at the list, looked at Mara. He said, "Donner." It was not a question. She looked at him. "What do you know?" Nothing I can prove. But 3 weeks ago, I was in the parking garage after the web debrief. Donner came out behind me. He asked me which floor the safe house detail was operating from. I told him I didn't know because I genuinely didn't. But the question bothered me, and I logged it in my personal notes the same night. He reached into his jacket and produced a small spiral notebook, the kind that cost $1 at a drugstore, and contained, in Deshaun Marsh's case, 6 years of precisely dated observations. He put it on the table like it was evidence, which it now was. Mara looked at the notebook. She looked at Deshaun. Something moved across her face that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but lived in the territory between them. The recognition, deep and private, that the right kind of partnership is one of the few things that holds when everything else breaks. She said, "You logged a question." He said, "I log everything that bothers me. You taught me that." What followed in the next 4 hours was the quietest and most methodical kind of investigation. Not the kind that fills television screens with running and shouting, but the kind that happens in stillness, between people who know that
Evidence is patient, and truth is structural, and the only way to find it is to build toward it one verifiable fact at a time. Mara pulled Dahar's access logs for the past 60 days. Every file he had opened, every system he had queried, every timestamp of entry and exit from the secure document management server. She laid them out on the conference table in chronological order and read them the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, looking not for what was there, but for the shape of what was missing. 3 documents had been accessed by Donner at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 weeks ago. The documents were part of the web protection file. The access was logged but had not triggered a review flag because each document was within Donner's authorized viewing permissions, individually. Together, accessed in sequence at midnight, they constituted the 3 pieces of information she had described to Karimi: location, testimony schedule, DA contact. She sat back. Across the table, Karimi said nothing. Dion said nothing. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, Chicago was beginning to suggest the idea of morning, a gray lightening at the edges of the sky that had nothing to do with warmth. Mara said, "I need to find out who he talked to. We have the what. I need the why and the who, and I need them before Donner knows we're looking." She stood up and walked to the window. She stood there for a long moment, her back to the room, looking at the city below. The city she had spent 14 years protecting from the worst of itself. The city that had, somewhere in its machinery, allowed a frightened and decent man to die because someone inside the bureau had decided that $40 million was worth more than a promise. When she turned around, her face carried an expression her team had learned to recognize over the years. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more durable. The expression of a woman who has made a decision that she intends to keep. She said, "Donner is going to come in this morning at 8, same as always. He is going to sit at his desk and act like he doesn't know that Marcus is dead, and we are going to let him do that. We are going to be completely normal. And while he is being normal, I am going to find every thread that connects him to whoever paid for Marcus Webb's silence, and I am going to follow every one of them until there is no question left to answer." Karimi said, "Mara, IA is going to want—" "IA can wait 48 hours, she said. "What I'm asking for is 48 hours before this becomes institutional, because once it becomes institutional, it leaks. And if it leaks, whoever is above Donner in this chain vanishes, and we spend the next 3 years trying to rebuild a case from nothing." The room was quiet. Karimi looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, 48 hours, not a minute more." She nodded. "That's all I need." The first ghost appeared at 9:14 that morning in the form of a phone number. Mara had spent the pre-dawn hours requesting, through channels that bypassed the field office's internal system entirely,
routed instead through a direct contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office she had cultivated over a decade, a comprehensive record of every outgoing call made from Craig Donner's bureau-issued cell phone over the preceding 90 days. She wasn't supposed to have it yet. She had it by 8:55. Dion brought it to her in a sealed envelope without a word, set it on her desk, and went to get them both coffee, because he understood that some evidence needed to be read in a particular kind of silence. The number appeared 4 times. The first call was 63 days ago, duration 11 minutes. The second was 41 days ago, duration 4 minutes. The third was 22 days ago, duration 27 minutes, 3 weeks before Marcus Webb died, 11 days after Donner's midnight access to the protection file. The fourth call was 6 days ago, duration 45 seconds, a brief call, the kind you make when you have been told the job is done and you want the confirmation to last as short a time as possible. She ran the number through 3 separate databases before it surfaced in the fourth, a registered prepaid carrier account linked to a logistics company in Cicero called Brentwood Supply Solutions. She knew that name. It was in the Alderman file. It was one of the shell companies. She sat with that for a moment. The connection was clean, almost insulting in its directness, which meant either Donner was sloppy in a way that surprised her given how carefully the rest of the operation had been constructed, or the number was a cutout, designed to be findable and lead somewhere controlled. She circled the fourth call, 45 seconds, 6 days ago. That call had happened after the protection file had been accessed, after the testimony schedule had been transmitted, but before Marcus Webb had been reported missing, which meant that 6 days ago someone had called Donner to confirm something that hadn't happened yet, and Donner had answered. She found Dion in the break room and said, "I need you to run Brentwood Supply Solutions, every registered officer, every filing address, every UCC submission going back 7 years. Don't use the office system. Use your personal laptop and the Federal Business Registry access I set up for you after the Cortez case." He didn't ask questions. He said, 2 hours. She said, 1. He said, 90 minutes. She almost smiled. Almost. At 10 a.m., Craig Donner arrived at the field office carrying a coffee from the shop on the corner, wearing a pressed gray shirt, saying good morning to the desk agent, with the easy naturalness of a man who believed himself invisible. Mara watched him from across the floor through the glass partition of her office. She watched the way he moved, unhurried, occupying space with the moderate confidence of a man who has decided his choices are behind him and nothing ahead requires urgency. She had interviewed
hundreds of people who had done terrible things. She had learned over 14 years that guilt did not look the way most people imagined it. It did not fidget or avoid eye contact or sweat through its clothing. Guilt, in practiced people, looked like routine. It looked like a man walking to his desk, setting down his coffee, opening his computer, and beginning his morning with the performance of normalcy that was so complete it had become the new actual. She turned back to her desk. She did not look at him again for 3 hours. At 11:30, her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, which meant it was from the one person who contacted her this way, a source she had protected for 5 years, a mid-level deputy in the city contracts office named Thomas Vale, who had, over those 5 years, provided her with information that had shaped 2 major prosecutions and whose identity she had guarded with a ferocity that was both professional and personal. The text said only, "Donner was at the Alderman dinner, October. Check the reservation list under the name C. Donnelly." She stared at that for a long time. Then she opened her desk drawer, took out the small leather notebook she kept separate from any digital record, and wrote down 3 words: before the transfer. Donner had transferred to violent crimes 14 months ago. The Alderman dinner, if her memory of the case timeline served, had been 13 months ago, 1 month after the transfer.
which meant the relationship between Donner and Alderman's network had not developed during the investigation. It had preceded it. Someone had placed Donner inside the unit specifically to compromise the Alderman case from its earliest stages. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city again. The city was doing what cities do in the middle of a working day, moving, indifferent, enormous, full of people who were not thinking about Vincent Alderman or Craig Donner or Marcus Webb because they had no reason to. She thought about Marcus Webb sitting in that conference room 8 months ago with his fireproof safe and his hard drive and his fear and his courage, and she thought about the promise she had made him, and she thought about the fact that promises kept posthumously are the most expensive kind. She said quietly to the window, to no one, "I'm going to find all of it." She meant it the way she meant everything, completely, without reservation, and with the understanding that meaning something and doing something are the same act when you are built the way she was built.
Dion's 90 minutes became 2 hours and 11 minutes, and when he appeared in Mara's office doorway, he was carrying his personal laptop and wearing an expression she had learned to read over 6 years as his particular version of carefully managed alarm, the look he wore when the facts were worse than the theory. He sat down, turned the laptop toward her, and said, "Brentwood Supply Solutions has 12 registered officers over the past 7 years. 11 of them are shell names, no social security match, no employment record, no physical address. The 12th is real." He pointed to a name on the screen, Gerald Wainwright. She looked at that name. She had heard it before, not in the Alderman file, but in a briefing 3 months ago, a federal corruption inquiry being run out of the Springfield field office, targeting a state-level procurement official. Wainwright was mentioned as a peripheral figure, not a target. Background. She said, "How peripheral was Wainwright to Springfield?" Dion said, "I called my contact there on the way here, off the record." He paused. "Wainwright isn't peripheral. He's central. Springfield has been building on him for 2 years, but they've been doing it quietly because they believe he has a source inside federal law enforcement who has been alerting him when inquiries get close." The room was very still. Mara said, "They think the source is in Springfield's office." Dion said, "They did until I called this morning and told them we had a potential different location for the leak." She understood the full shape of it then, the architecture she had described to Karimi hours before, but now extended, expanded, the blueprint of something that had been constructed over years and reached further than one investigation, one unit, one city. This was not a case of an agent who had been corrupted by proximity to a target. This was a deliberate placement, possibly 2 placements inside 2 separate federal offices, designed to insulate a network that moved money and influence at a level that required long-term institutional protection. And Marcus Webb had been the thread that, if pulled all the way, would unravel it. The question that had been forming in the back of her mind since 4 in the morning now arrived fully. Who above Craig Donner had the authority and the access to arrange a transfer into a sensitive unit without triggering standard background review? She picked up her phone and called Karimi. He picked up on the second ring, and she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it before you decide how you feel about the question." He said, "Go ahead." "Donner's transfer to our unit 14 months ago, who approved it?" Silence. Then Karimi said, "The approval came from Deputy Director Holt's office." Mara Reyes said nothing for a moment. Gerald Holt, 26 years with the Bureau, 3 commendations, currently the 2nd highest-ranking official in the Chicago field office. She had met him twice, a tall man, silver-haired, with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent.
Karimi managing the impressions he made. She said, "Karimi? Yeah. We need to expand the 48-hour window into something bigger, much bigger, and we need to do it in a way that nothing inside this building knows about until we're ready." Another silence, longer this time. Karimi, to his credit, did not say, "This is above my pay grade," or "Let me think about it," or any of the several things a cautious man might reasonably say when the implication of a conversation points toward the second highest official in his office. He said, "What do you need?" She told him. She needed a direct channel to the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility that bypassed the field office chain. She needed the U.S. Attorney's Office looped in under a sealed communication protocol. She needed Dion's Springfield contact brought into a compartmentalized information share. And she needed all of it done in the next 6 hours without creating a single piece of documentation that touched the field office's internal network. Karimi said, "Mara." She said, "I know." He said, "If you're wrong." "I'm not wrong," she said, "and you know I'm not wrong. The question isn't whether this is real. The question is whether we have the courage to follow it where it goes." There was a pause that lasted long enough to be meaningful. Then David Karimi, who had spent 20 years doing the right thing in the methodical and procedurally correct way that institutional careers are built on, said, "Make the calls. I'll cover the logistics." She hung up and looked at Dion. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name, and then she could. It was the expression of someone watching a person carry something very heavy over a very long distance, willing them across. She said, "I'm going to need you to go home tonight and act like everything is fine." He said, "And you?" "I'm going to need you to trust me on something." She reached into her desk drawer and removed an envelope, sealed, with his name written on the outside in her handwriting. She set it on the desk between them. "If I'm not reachable in 48 hours, open this. It has everything, every thread, every document, every contact, everything you need to take it the rest of the way without me." Dion looked at the envelope. He looked at her. He said quietly, "What are you planning to do?" She said, "The only thing that's going to work. I'm going to walk into the room and I'm going to give whoever is watching this operation something to react to. Because the only way to confirm the architecture is to apply pressure to a load-bearing wall and watch what moves." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I hate this plan." She said, "I know." He said, "I think it's the right plan." She said, "I know that too." She found Craig Donner at his desk at 4:30 p.m. and sat down in the empty chair beside it without invitation, the way she sat down everywhere, as if space reorganized itself around her presence rather than offering resistance to it. He looked up. His expression was practiced and neutral, the face of a man performing normalcy, and she watched it perform for a moment before she said, in a voice that was entirely conversational, "I know about the October dinner, Craig." The performance didn't stop. To his credit, it barely flickered. He said, "What October dinner?" She said, "The one at Carmichael's on the 14th. You were there under the name Donnelly. Gerald Wainwright reserved the table. Vincent Alderman paid the bill." His hands, resting on his keyboard, did not move. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes recalibrated in a way that she felt rather than saw, the moment when a person who has been telling themselves a story about safety recognizes that the story has an ending they didn't write. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." She nodded, as if he had said something entirely reasonable. She said, "I'm not here to arrest you, Craig. I'm not wearing a wire. I'm not recording this conversation. This is one agent talking to another agent, and what I'm telling you is that the architecture of this whole arrangement is about to become visible to people who will make very different decisions about your future than I will." She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, "You have a daughter, 8 years old. I've seen her picture on your desk." He went very still. She said, "I'm not threatening you. I'm saying that the people above you in this chain have already decided that you are expendable. They let Marcus Webb die rather than let the case reach them. Do you think they will make a different calculation about you?" Something shifted in his face.
Not a collapse, he was too controlled for that, but a hairline fracture in the surface of the performance, barely visible, present. She said, "I'm going to give you a number. It's not a bureau number. It's the direct line of a federal prosecutor who has been authorized to offer you a proffer agreement in exchange for full cooperation. This offer exists for the next 24 hours. After that, I can't protect what happens to you." She placed a card on his desk, no name on it, just a phone number, handwritten. She stood up. She said, "For what it's worth, and I know it's not much worth right now, I understand how these things happen. I understand how a person gets into a room they never planned to enter. What I don't forgive is that a man is dead." She walked away. She did not look back. She was back in her office in 3 minutes, door closed, and she sat down behind her desk and held her hands flat on the surface to stop them from shaking. Not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining the controlled performance of certainty, when the truth was that she had just played the most critical gamble of her career on the assumption that Craig Donner still had enough of his better self intact to respond to being offered a way out. 2 hours passed. She worked. She documented. She ate a granola bar and drank her third coffee of the day. At 6:47 p.m., her personal cell phone rang. She looked at the number. It was the number on the card she had placed on Donner's desk, calling her back. She answered. The voice on the other end was not the federal prosecutor. It was Craig Donner. He said, "I want a lawyer present." She said, "That is your right, and I will arrange it." He said, "And I want witness protection for my daughter. Before I say a single word, I want it in writing that she is protected regardless of outcome." She said, "I will get you that in writing." There was a pause. Then Craig Donner said, in a voice stripped of performance, stripped of the careful neutrality he had worn all day like armor, the voice of a man who was, underneath all of it, genuinely afraid. "Holt didn't just approve my transfer. He recruited me 3 years ago, before the Alderman case existed. He told me the Bureau was running an internal integrity operation and needed someone inside violent crimes to monitor a potential compromised agent. He said it was sanctioned. He said it was classified. By the time I understood what I was actually doing, I was too far in to believe anyone would believe the difference." She said nothing. She let him speak. He said, "Marcus Webb, I didn't know they were going to kill him. I passed the information because Holt told me it was needed for the operation. I believed—" His voice broke for a fraction of a second, just enough to let the truth through before the discipline closed it back up. "I told myself I believed it." She said, "Come in tonight. Bring nothing. I will have a lawyer and a prosecutor and a protection agreement waiting. Use the building entrance on Wacker. Tell no one." She hung up. She sat for a moment in the stillness of her office with the city dark outside the windows and the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and the weight of what she now held. Not just evidence, but a confession, and not just a confession, but a path that led, without ambiguity, to Gerald Holt. She picked up her phone and called Karimi. She said, "It's moving. Get OPR on the line, tonight." What followed was 31 hours that Mara Reyes would remember for the rest of her life, not as a sequence of dramatic events, but as a long corridor that had to be walked entirely, without shortcut, without the luxury of skipping any door. Donner came in at 9 p.m. He sat across from a federal prosecutor named Elena Vasquez in a conference room on the 14th floor, with his court-appointed attorney beside him and his hands folded on the table, and told them everything he knew, in the organized, detailed way of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is finally setting it down. It took 4 hours. Mara sat in on the first 90 minutes, then stepped out and let Vasquez work. She stood in the corridor outside the conference room and leaned against the wall and stared at the opposite wall and thought about Marcus Webb. She thought about his fireproof safe. She thought about 3 years of financial records and the courage it takes to carry evidence in silence for that long, and the faith it takes to finally hand it to someone and say, "I trust you to do something with this." She had made him a promise. She had not kept it. That was the truth, and she did not flinch from it, because flinching from truths was not something she permitted herself. What she permitted herself instead was the decision that the only answer to a broken promise was to make it matter by finishing what Marcus had started, by making his evidence count, by ensuring that every person in the chain that had killed him faced the full weight of what they had done. This was not revenge. She had spent 14 years learning the difference between justice and revenge, and the difference was architecture. Justice built something that held, something that changed the structure of the world, even slightly in the direction of accountability. Revenge was just a reaction, personal and temporary and ultimately hollow. She was not interested in hollow. At 1 a.m., Vasquez came out of the conference room and handed Mara a summary of Donner's statement. She read it in 6 minutes. It was comprehensive, specific, and corroborated by documentary evidence Donner had been keeping, not out of conscience, she suspected, but out of the same self-protective instinct that had made him keep the meetings brief and the records simple. Evidence he had gathered on Holt in case the relationship ever became dangerous to him. It had taken him 3 years to understand that the relationship had been dangerous from the first conversation. The statement connected Gerald Holt to Gerald Wainwright, to the Alderman Network, to the suppression of the Springfield inquiry, and to the death of Marcus Webb. Not through direct instruction, Holt
Was too experienced for that, but through a chain of communications that Donner had documented and through Donner's own testimony about what had been said, by whom, in what room, on what date. It was not a slam, it was a scaffold. Enough to build on, enough to justify a search warrant and a formal OPR investigation and the suspension of Holt's access and authority while the investigation proceeded. She called Karimi at 1:15 a.m. He was still in the building, which told her everything about the kind of man he was when the situation required it. She said, "We have enough for the warrant." He said, "I'll call OPR." She said, "Karimi." "Yeah. When this is over, whatever happens to me as a result of how I handled the past 30 hours, I need you to know that I would do it exactly the same way." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. That's what makes you effective and occasionally a complete nightmare to supervise." She said, "I know." The warrant for Holt's office, his personal devices, and his access to the federal server was signed by a federal judge at 3:30 a.m. OPR agents executed it at 6 a.m. when Holt arrived at the office and found, instead of his morning briefing, 5 agents and a suspension notice, and Mara Reyes standing in the corridor outside his office with her badge on her belt and her expression giving absolutely nothing away. Holt looked at her. He was composed in the way powerful people are composed when they are surprised. The composure someone whose instinct is to negotiate, to assess, to find the leverage point. He said, "Agent Reyes, I imagine this was your doing." She said, "A witness is dead, Deputy Director. That's the doing." He said, "These allegations are going to be investigated thoroughly, and I'm confident they will be." "They will be," she said, "thoroughly. That's why OPR is here and not the field office. No internal review. Federal process, start to finish." He looked at her for a moment longer. Something in his assessment of her shifted. She could see it, the recalibration, the recognition that the woman standing in front of him had not, as he perhaps had assumed in the months he had managed her from above, any interest whatsoever in the politics of the situation, the career implications, the institutional discomfort. She was simply the person who had followed the evidence to where it led and was standing at the destination without apology. He said nothing more.
He walked with the OPR agents into his office, and the door closed, and that was, functionally, the end of Gerald Holt's 26-year career, though the legal proceedings would take considerably longer.
3 weeks after Holt's suspension, the investigation had expanded in the way that well-constructed cases expand when they are given proper institutional support. Methodically, through corroborating evidence, through the Springfield inquiry finally being unsealed and linked to Chicago, through financial records that connected Wainwright to a second shell company that none of them had identified before. Vincent Alderman was indicted on 11 counts. Wainwright was indicted on 7. 2 aldermen and the deputy commissioner were named in the federal complaint. The shell company in Cicero was dissolved by order of the court. Mara sat in on every major debrief. She filed her reports on time, without embellishment, without the kind of editorializing that would have been entirely justifiable, given everything she had lived through in those 31 hours. She answered every OPR question about her own conduct with the same completeness she brought to every investigation, including the question of whether she had followed proper protocol in confronting Donner without a wire, without supervision, without logging the conversation. She said, "No, I did not follow proper protocol. I made a judgment that following proper protocol in that moment would have allowed the subject to alert Holt before we had enough to act. I believe the outcome justifies the method. I accept that the Bureau may assess that differently." They did assess it differently. She received a formal reprimand, her second. She printed it and put it next to the first one on the inside of her closet door. Dion found this out about a month later and said, "You're collecting them." She said, "Evidence of good decisions made in bad systems." He said, "You're impossible." She said, "You've told me that before." He said, "It's still true." Craig Donner pled guilty to obstruction and conspiracy charges. His cooperation agreement held. He received a reduced sentence of 4 years, and his daughter was enrolled in a federal protection program during the trial period. Mara attended exactly none of the sentencing hearings. She had done what she needed to do with Craig Donner, which was give him the chance to be better than his worst decision, and he had taken it, and that was the full extent of what she needed from him. What she was not prepared for, what arrived on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the indictments, in the form of a letter forwarded through the U.S. Attorney's Office, was the envelope from a law firm in Rockford, Illinois, that contained a single folded sheet of paper and a photograph. The photograph was of a 9-year-old girl, Sophia Mendez. The letter was from the girl's mother, Elena Mendez, now 61, still living in the same city. "I know you don't know who I am. I was told by a detective who worked my daughter's case that you requested her files 17 years ago when you applied to the FBI. I was told recently that your work in Chicago has been covered in the federal record and that you are the kind of agent my daughter would have needed. I wanted you to know that I still light a candle for Sophia every Tuesday. I wanted you to know that someone who has done what you have done is, in my small and private way, part of that candle." Mara read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, in the back, where she kept the things that were too important to file and too personal to display. Then she sat for a long time in her office, with the city visible through the window, going about its large, indifferent life, and she allowed herself something she rarely permitted, a moment of genuine stillness, not the functional stillness of controlled emotion, but the real kind, the kind that comes when a person has followed a thread for 17 years and found, at the end of it, something that was not resolution exactly, because some things don't resolve, but was acknowledgement, the knowledge that the thread had been worth following, that the walking had mattered, that the room in her mind with its grain-lined floorboards and its yellow tape and its mother on the lawn had produced, at long remove, something other than only grief. She thought about what she had told Dion about sleep, that it was for people who weren't afraid of what happened when their minds went quiet. She had believed that for 17 years. She sat there in the Tuesday morning light, and she considered, for the first time in a long time, the possibility that the room might eventually allow her to rest. Not forget, not move on, just rest. There was a knock at her office door. She said, "Come in."
Dion opened the door and looked at her face, and being Dion Marsh, who had spent 6 years learning to read what she didn't say, he understood something had happened and did not ask what. He said, "You have a briefing in 15 minutes. New case." She took a breath. She straightened in her chair. The expression that settled back onto her face was the one the world knew: controlled, precise, attentive, authority worn as naturally as a second skin. She said, "What kind of case?" He said, "Missing persons, family in Evanston, 2 kids, 8 and 11. She was already standing up. She was already reaching for her badge. She said, "Who's the lead detective?" Dion held the door open for her. He said, "Woman named Carrillo. Good rep, solid." Mara walked through the door and into the corridor, and Dion fell into step beside her the way he always did, slightly behind and to the right, the exact position of a partner who trusts the person in front to set the pace. She said, "Brief me on the way." He said, "Always do." They walked down the corridor, toward the elevator doors that opened onto the lobby, toward the lobby doors that opened onto the city that was always waiting with its next injustice and its next person who needed someone to make a promise and keep it. The Evanston case took 11 days. It ended at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday in a warehouse in Waukegan with 2 children who were cold and frightened and physically unharmed, wrapped in emergency blankets in the back of an ambulance, while Mara stood 20 feet away and watched their mother run across the parking lot and drop to her knees on the wet asphalt and pull them both against her. And she watched this without moving, without turning away, because she had learned over 14 years that bearing witness to the good endings was as important as bearing witness to the bad ones, that a person who only ever sees what goes wrong begins to believe that is all there is, and Mara Reyes did not believe that was all there was. She had simply learned to require evidence before believing in anything else. The man responsible was in custody. 3 accomplices were in custody. The evidence chain was clean, the documentation complete, the process followed in every particular, including this time in a way that would survive any OPR review without a single asterisk. She had built the case correctly from the first hour because she had had the time to build it correctly, and because Dion had been beside her, and because Detective Carrillo was exactly as good as her reputation, precise and uncompromising, and because the 3 of them together had the kind of working chemistry that is rare and should be treated as the resource it is. She drove home at 4 a.m. She did something she almost never did. She made tea instead of coffee. She sat at her kitchen table in the quiet of her apartment, and she drank the tea, and she looked at the wall across from her, which had nothing on it. She had never put anything on that wall, not in the 4 years she had lived there. Not because she had no pictures worth hanging, but because she had never wanted the wall to become a place she looked at when she needed to feel something. She had always been afraid of what would happen if a blank wall became essential. Now she sat and looked at it, and it was just a wall, and she was just tired in the clean way that comes after work that has gone right, and the tea was warm in her hands, and the city outside was quiet in the way cities are quiet at 4 a.m., which is not actually quiet, but is a register of noise low enough that the mind can find some space inside it. She thought about Elena Mendez's letter. She thought about the candle lit every Tuesday. She thought about the word acknowledgement and what it meant, not absolution, not the erasing of what had happened, but the recognition that the effort had been real and had pointed in the right direction and had, in some small, permanent way, changed the shape of things. She had spent 17 years afraid that if she ever allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she carried, it would stop her. She had kept it at the level of motivation, fuel, the engine of her persistence. She had never let it be grief. Sitting in her kitchen at 4 a.m. with a cup of tea and a blank wall and 2 children alive in Evanston who hadn't been alive in her professional certainty 11 days ago, she let it be grief. It was not the collapse she had feared. It was not the end of her capacity to work or to decide or to move. It was
Simply the acknowledgement that the child on the lawn in Rockford was real, that her mother's wound was real, that the years of carrying it had been real, and that real things deserved to be felt in their full weight rather than only used. She cried for approximately 4 minutes. It was not dramatic, it was not cinematic. It was the quiet, private grief of someone who has been strong for a very long time and has chosen, in a safe place, to put the strength down for a moment and feel what is underneath it. Then she finished her tea. She rinsed the cup in the sink. She went to her bedroom and she lay down on the bed in the dark, and she thought about nothing in particular, and she fell asleep, and she did not dream of the room in Rockford. And when she woke at 9 a.m. to her phone ringing, first ring, voice clear, Reyes, she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever the world was about to ask of her. The case that came in that morning was a federal wire fraud allegation with connections to organized crime that would take her team 4 months to build and prosecute. It was complex, dense with financial architecture, requiring the kind of sustained and meticulous attention that was, for Mara Reyes, not a burden, but a language she was native to. Dion brought her coffee before the briefing. She did not thank him because she never thanked him for coffee, and he did not expect thanks because he had long since understood that accepting the coffee was its own form of acknowledgement between them, the language of partnership that requires no translation. She stood at the head of the briefing room and looked at her team, 6 agents, 3 analysts, 1 detective on loan from the city, and they looked at her, and the room had the quality of attention that rooms have when the person at the front has earned it, genuinely, through years of being exactly what they appeared to be. She opened the case file. She said, "Here is what we know. Here is what we don't know. Here is what we are going to find out, and how we are going to find it, and what it is going to mean when we do." She spoke for 20 minutes. Nobody looked at their phones. She thought briefly of the morning 17 years ago on a sidewalk in Rockford, watching a mother on a lawn, watching a detective staring at his shoes. She thought of the decision that had grown from that moment, not impulsive, not simple, but deep and structural, the kind of decision that becomes the architecture of a life. She had built her life on the belief that the truth followed all the way to its end, regardless of where it led or what it cost, was worth the following. She had followed it to bad endings and good endings and complicated endings that were neither. She had followed it into institutions that resisted it and up chains of command that actively obstructed it. She had followed it at cost to her career and her comfort and her sleep and her heart. And standing at the front of that briefing room on an ordinary Thursday morning, she knew, with the simple and uncomplicated certainty that is the reward of a life lived in consistent alignment with its deepest convictions, that she would follow it again, all the way, without flinching, because the weight of what she carried was not a burden. It was the weight that held her to the ground. It was the weight that made her real. She said, "Let's get to work." And they did.